you're starting a story, no, in the beginning, it was the best of times, it was blatant plagiarism. This is hard. There is a special kind of horror that is sitting, staring at a blank page and trying to come up with the perfect opening line and knowing the rest of your story rests on it, because if you can't suck the reader in with the first line, the rest of the story will never get read. So it has to be perfect, impactful, memorable, and all done in just a few words. Have I dissipated your fears yet? No? Well, then let's talk about some do's and don'ts that will hopefully help you come up with a hook better than this mess of an opening.
The end.
So what is a hook? It's the opening line, the very first line of your story, except it's really not. For starters, it's not the very first line. It could be the first line or the first paragraph, or if you do it right, it could be the first page. A hook is meant to get the readers invested, make them ask questions, make them care about your characters, and you don't need to do that necessarily in the very first line, but you have to keep them invested long enough to start asking those questions. Maybe you can get them asking questions after the first line, maybe you need a whole paragraph to do that, and that's fine, but then you have to write a really good paragraph to get them there. It takes some pressure off the very first line, but that's all the more you have to write to get the reader's attention and to keep it.
Pay attention.
And that's not even talking about prologues. I'm not going to get into prologues in this video, but they're a separate part of your story meant to introduce characters or events before you get into the plot. And they are a double-edged sword because you need that hook in the prologue to get the readers invested, but not every reader reads the prologue, so you need another hook when the story actually starts to get those readers invested and hopefully go back and read the prologue. But again, not a video about prologues. Let's get into the do's and don'ts. When I say don't start with a fake out, my mind immediately goes to dreams. Those aren't all the types of fake outs you can have, but they're the example I'm going to use. You can write dreams in your book, but they should not be where your story starts, because then you'll have a scene and setting your readers are getting invested, only to have the rug pulled out from under them. Why should I care what happens next if I know everything that just happened didn't matter? It's a good way to lose investment and trust from your readers, and it also leads to another bad hook, having your character waking up. You do not want to start your story with a character just waking up. No one cares what their morning routine is. Now, there are some instances where them waking up will work, but they have to wake up for a reason other than their alarm clock going off. You want to jump into some sort of action, something that will have your readers asking what's happening and why. What matters less is if your character knows, because you will have time to fill in your character and the reader later. All you're trying to do with the hook is get the reader invested. And another thing that will kill the investment is a time skip. If you want to start your story off at a different time or a different place than where the story will happen, then you need a prologue. That's what they're there for. That's why you need two hooks. Because if I get invested in a particular characters in a particular setting at a particular time, then why should I read the rest of the book if it's following different characters in different places at a different time? You can have time skips later in your book, but you need a through thread to keep your reader invested. And the same goes for flashbacks. The hook is all about getting your reader to ask questions. So why would you spoil that by revealing something about your characters or world that could be part of the mystery that keeps them reading? Again, you will have plenty of time to put in flashbacks later. What you will not have time for, or a second chance at, is introducing who your characters are as the plot is happening. It doesn't matter nearly as much why they are the way they are. It can be so tempting to start telling your story from a different character's point of view. It can teach us things about our protagonist or introduce plot elements that will all pay off later. But again, that's what you need to put in your prologue. The reader does not need to know right away why the evil villain is trying to take over the world. That can be told later. What does matter is what happens to your main character, the person your readers are meant to invest in. If you start focusing on someone else, your readers won't care about your protagonist. And yeah, maybe the scene with the evil villain enacting their plan is vital to the plot. Maybe it will introduce the initial conflict for the protagonist. But again, you want to keep your readers guessing. Why would you start your story handing them something that could be such juicy questions and such satisfying payoff if you use it later on? So use your hook to focus on the main characters and getting your readers invested in them. And another way to do that is if you... Pop quiz. Name all the dwarves from The Hobbit. Can you name all 14 of them? If you can, congratulations, you've won Tolkien Fan of the Month. If you can't, that's fine, because again, 14 of them all introduced very fast in a more plot-driven book. And if you want to write a character-driven book and have your readers care about more characters than just the protagonist, don't introduce them all at once, and especially not in the hook. Look, I love ensemble casts. My own story is an ensemble cast, but I do not start introducing all the characters that will be important to the plot right away, because doing that can be very confusing to the reader, make them care less about the protagonist, or take away from the plot, which will all lead to the reader losing investment. Again, you will have time to introduce all 30 of your main characters later, so for now, it's fine to leave them guessing. You can even have your protagonist talk about those other characters, and that could lead to more questions, since your readers will want to find out who those people are and why they're important to the protagonist. And this goes not just with characters, but with the world building in your story. I know I just broke my own formula, but you've made it this far in the video, so I can get a little more wild because you're already invested. See what I did there? Now, as for info dumping, which is like candy to writers, it's so good, but so bad for your story. I get it, you've just come up with this whole world and you want to write about it, but you can't just put in these long blocks of text explaining it. That gets boring so fast for the reader, and if the economics of the world doesn't affect the plot, then you don't have to ever put it in your book. And I get why that's frustrating, but it's part of being a good writer, and you especially can't info dump too early. There may come a time when it's important to the plot why the weather is the way it is, and you can talk about it at length, but it's not at the beginning of your book.
In the beginning.
Honestly, talking about this has me thinking about the novel version of Wicked. It is a book that I have conflicting feelings for. It was an interesting world and I love the musical, but the book is on my did not finish because it made me sad list. And it's one of the only books I ever read where I skipped the first chapter. Don't get me wrong, I tried to read it, but it was so info dumpy, and if I had not consumed the musical before the book and was not already invested in the characters, I wouldn't have read it at all. And you don't want that. Again, the hook is there to make your readers ask questions, not overwhelm them with information.
I need a break.
And that's really the big do for writing your hook. Add mystery. If you go and pick up a book and look at the synopsis, you'll find questions being posed. Will they save the world? Will the plot tear them apart? Will they find true love? It makes your readers ask those questions that will get them and keep them invested. And if you're still sitting here asking how to do that, that's fine. You do not have to write your story in chronological order. If you get halfway through your story and you come across the perfect hook, use it. If you get through the first draft with a weak first line, that's fine too. If you write a first hook only to come up with something better later, that's great. That's what I did. What's most important is that you go out and write and read.